The smell hit me first, a nauseating wave of sewage that made my eyes water as I stepped out of my car. But it wasn't coming from my lake cabin. It was coming from the sprawling deck of Patricia Whitmore's brand-new lakefront mansion, where 20 of her closest friends were gathered for what she'd been calling her victory celebration. My name is David, and I'd just returned from a week-long business trip to find that the woman who'd spent 2 years trying to destroy my family's peace had finally succeeded in stealing something from me. She'd tapped into my cabin's electrical system without permission, rerouting power to her own property through an elaborate network of buried cables that must have cost her thousands of dollars to install. What Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't have known when she hired those contractors to dig up half the shoreline, was that my cabin's electrical system had been jerry-rigged by my grandfather 60 years ago. And the main power line she'd tapped into didn't just feed electricity to my property. It also powered the pump for my septic system. For the past week, while I'd been in Chicago closing a business deal, Patricia had been unknowingly pumping raw sewage directly into the foundation of her million-dollar dream home. And now, as her guests fled from the deck in horror, she was about to learn that some victories come with a very expensive price. But this story doesn't start with sewage and revenge. It starts with a simple desire for peace, a lake that held 3 generations of family memories, and a woman who couldn't stand the idea that happiness existed somewhere she couldn't control it. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because understanding Patricia Whitmore requires understanding the paradise she was determined to destroy. Cabin 47 on Pine Lake had been in my family since 1963. My grandfather, Robert, bought it with money he'd saved from working 30 years at the railroad. Back then, Pine Lake was nothing more than a collection of modest fishing cabins scattered around a pristine mountain lake, connected by dirt roads and a shared understanding that everyone came here to escape the complications of city life. The cabin itself was simple 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the clearest water I'd ever seen. My grandfather had built most of the furniture by hand, installed the plumbing himself, and wired the electrical system with the confident improvisation of a man who'd learned to fix things during the Great Depression. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. I inherited the cabin when my grandfather passed in 2018, along with his stories about the early days on Pine Lake, when neighbors looked out for each other and the biggest drama was whether the fish were biting on the North Shore or the South. Those days ended when Whitmore Development Corporation bought the old Henderson property in 2021. Patricia Whitmore was everything you'd expect from someone who made millions developing luxury communities. Perfectly styled silver hair, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no unless it was followed by a legal settlement. She didn't just buy the Henderson property, she transformed it. What had once been a modest cabin on 2 acres became a 6,000 square foot lakefront mansion with a private beach, a boat dock that could accommodate a yacht, and landscaping that looked like something from a resort magazine. The construction took 18 months and violated every unofficial rule that had governed Pine Lake for 60 years. Heavy machinery rumbled past our cabins at 6 in the morning. Contractors parked their trucks wherever they pleased, blocking driveways and access roads. Construction debris ended up in the lake, and the constant noise made it impossible to enjoy the peace that had drawn our families here in the first place. But Patricia was just getting started. 2 months after moving into her mansion, she called a community meeting at the Pine Lake Community Center, a building my grandfather had helped construct in 1967. "I've been doing some research into our community's legal status," Patricia announced to the 24 property owners who'd gathered on a Tuesday evening in September. "And I've discovered that we have no formal governance structure. No HOA, no community standards, no mechanism for protecting our property values." She paused, scanning the room with the expression of someone delivering good news. I'm proposing that we establish the Pine Lake Homeowners Association with proper bylaws and enforcement mechanisms to ensure our community maintains the standards that attracted us all here. My neighbor Bill Henderson, whose family had sold Patricia the property she'd demolished, raised his hand. Patricia, we've never needed an HOA before. Everyone here gets along fine. Patricia's smile was sharp as winter ice. Bill, I think you'll find that getting along isn't the same as maintaining property values. Some of our older properties are beginning to show their age. Her eyes found mine across the room. And some of our residents have different ideas about what constitutes appropriate maintenance and community standards. I should have spoken up then. I should have recognized the threat for what it was. Instead, I sat quietly, assuming that Patricia's grand plans would die from lack of interest. I was wrong. Within 6 weeks, Patricia had convinced a majority of property owners to support the formation of the Pine Lake HOA. Her arguments were persuasive: better property values, professional landscaping for common areas, improved security, and protection against problematic neighbors who might lower the tone of the community. The HOA bylaws she'd drafted were 37 pages long and covered everything from approved paint colors to the maximum number of vehicles allowed per property. Reading through them felt like reviewing a corporate contract, not a set of neighborhood guidelines. But buried on page 23 was the clause that would change everything. All properties within the Pine Lake community boundaries are subject to periodic inspections to ensure compliance with community standards. Properties found to be in violation may be subject to daily fines until violations are corrected. In cases of severe or ongoing violations, the HOA reserves the right to place liens against non-compliant properties. I voted against the HOA formation, along with 4 other property owners. But in Patricia's version of democracy, a simple majority was all she needed to assume authority over everyone's property, whether they'd agreed to it or not. The harassment started immediately. 2 weeks after the HOA bylaws were ratified, I received my first violation notice. According to Patricia's inspection, my cabin's exterior staining was inconsistent with community standards and needed to be refreshed with an approved color from the HOA's preferred palette. The approved colors were all variations of beige. My cabin had been stained with natural cedar oil for 60 years. It was the same honey gold color my grandfather had chosen, the same stain my father had reapplied every 5 years, the same finish that had protected the wood through decades of mountain weather. But it wasn't beige. This is about aesthetics, David, Patricia explained when I called to discuss the violation. We're trying to create a cohesive visual identity for the community. Your cabin looks rustic compared to the other properties. It's supposed to look rustic, I replied. It's a mountain cabin, not a suburban subdivision. Well, that's exactly the problem we're trying to solve, Patricia said smoothly. Pine Lake has tremendous potential as a luxury destination. But that potential is undermined when some properties don't meet the standards that serious buyers expect. I'm not selling my property, Patricia. There was a pause. Of course not. But your neighbors are concerned about their property values. And the HOA has a responsibility to protect the community's interests. The fine was $50 per day until the violation was corrected. Professional restaining would cost approximately $8,000, not because the work was complicated, but because the HOA bylaws required that all exterior work be performed by approved contractors who happened to charge premium rates for their services. I paid the fines for 3 weeks while researching my legal options. That's when I discovered that Patricia had been even more thorough than I'd realized. The HOA bylaws included a clause requiring that all legal challenges to HOA decisions be submitted to binding arbitration through a company called Mountain Property Mediation Services. The arbitrator assigned to Pine Lake cases was a retired judge named Harold Whitmore, Patricia's father. "You've got to be kidding me," I said to my attorney, Janet Morrison, when she explained the situation. "The arbitrator is her father?" "It's not illegal," Janet replied grimly. "Unethical, maybe, but not illegal. And since you're technically bound by the arbitration clause, challenging it in court would be expensive and time-consuming. So I'm trapped." "Not trapped. But you're definitely playing a rigged game. I paid for the restaining using approved contractors and approved colors that made my grandfather's cabin look like every other piece of generic architecture Patricia had imposed on Pine Lake. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 18 months, I received violations for everything imaginable. My dock was improperly maintained because it showed signs of weathering. My gravel driveway needed to be replaced with approved paving stones. My outdoor furniture was inconsistent with community standards because it was made of natural wood instead of synthetic materials. Each violation came with fines. Each fine increased in amount. And each payment felt like feeding money into a machine designed to drive me away from the property my family had loved for 60 years. The breaking point came last spring when Patricia issued a violation for my non-compliant electrical system. According to the notice, my cabin's exterior electrical connections were unsightly and potentially hazardous and needed to be upgraded to meet current community standards. The work would require trenching new lines underground, installing approved fixtures, and bringing everything up to code through Patricia's network of approved contractors. Estimated cost, $27,000. "This is insane," I told Janet during our phone consultation. "My electrical system works fine. It's been inspected by the county. There's nothing unsafe about it." "That may be true," Janet replied. "But according to the HOA bylaws, safety isn't the only consideration. They can require upgrades based on aesthetic standards." "Aesthetic standards for electrical wiring?" "David, this isn't about electrical wiring. This is about driving you off your property. Patricia wants your cabin, and she's using the HOA to make ownership so expensive that you'll have no choice but to sell." That night, I sat on my porch and looked out over the lake where I'd learned to fish, where I'd brought my ex-wife on our honeymoon, where I'd scattered my grandfather's ashes according to his final wishes. The water was still the same perfect shade of blue-green, but everything else had changed. Patricia's mansion dominated the shoreline like a monument to excess. Half the other cabins had been torn down and replaced with oversized homes that looked like they belonged in a suburb, not on a mountain lake. The dirt roads had been paved, the native vegetation had been replaced with manicured landscaping, and the sense of peaceful isolation that had defined Pine Lake for generations was gone. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I decided to fight Patricia's latest violation, even if it meant facing her father in arbitration. I hired Janet to represent me, gathered documentation proving my electrical system was safe and functional, and prepared to make my case. What I didn't know was that Patricia had already moved beyond using the HOA to harass me. She'd decided to take matters into her own hands. The first sign that Patricia had escalated her campaign came on a Tuesday morning in late May, when I discovered that my coffee maker wouldn't turn on. At first, I assumed it was a simple electrical problem. Mountain storms sometimes caused power fluctuations, and my grandfather's wiring, while functional, was definitely showing its age. But when I checked the circuit breaker, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed that my refrigerator was making an unusual humming sound, as if it was working harder than usual to maintain temperature. The lights in the kitchen seemed dimmer than normal. And my laptop, which had been plugged in overnight, showed only a partial charge. I called Eddie Kowalski, the local electrician who'd maintained my grandfather's wiring for the past 15 years. Eddie was a third-generation Pine Lake resident whose family had been servicing the original cabins since the 1970s. "Sounds like you're getting inconsistent voltage," Eddie said after I described the symptoms. "Could be a problem with the main line, or someone might be drawing more power than the system can handle." "Someone?" "Well, your cabin's on the same transformer as the Morrison place and the old Johnson property. If one of your neighbors installed something that draws a lot of juice, a hot tub, workshop equipment, something like that, it could affect everyone else on the line." Eddie came out that afternoon to test my electrical system. What he found made his weathered face crease with confusion. "David, this is the strangest thing I've seen in 30 years, he said, staring at his voltage meter. "Your power draw is all over the place. Sometimes you're getting full voltage. Sometimes you're down to about 60%. What could cause that? Honestly, it looks like someone's tapping into your line, drawing power intermittently, which would explain the fluctuations." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Tapping into my line?" "Yeah, like they've connected something to your electrical system without you knowing about it." Eddie looked around my property thoughtfully. "Have you seen any construction work lately? New lines being run? Contractors digging around your boundaries?" I had seen construction work, lots of it. For the past month, Patricia's property had been swarming with contractors installing what she'd described as landscape lighting and water features. I'd watched crews digging trenches all around the shoreline, running cables and pipes in elaborate patterns that seemed far more complex than necessary for outdoor lighting. "Eddie, could someone tap into my electrical system from another property?" "Theoretically, yeah, if they knew what they were doing and they had access to your main line. But it would be illegal as hell and expensive to set up." "How expensive?" Eddie scratched his head. "To do it right? Underground cables, proper connections, switching equipment to avoid detection? You'd be looking at maybe $15,000 to $20,000. More if you wanted to get fancy with it." $20,000. That was a lot of money to spend on stealing electricity, unless you were planning to steal a lot of electricity for a long time. Or unless you were trying to make someone else's electrical system so unreliable that they'd be forced to pay for expensive upgrades. That evening, I decided to do some reconnaissance. I waited until after dark, then walked the boundaries of my property with a flashlight, looking for any signs of recent digging or new electrical connections. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Along the shoreline that separated my property from Patricia's, someone had installed an elaborate network of underground cables. The work was professional grade, with proper conduits and carefully concealed connection points, but the cables were definitely running from my property toward Patricia's mansion. Following the cable route in the darkness, I discovered that the connection point was near my cabin's main electrical panel. Someone had installed a junction box behind the large pine tree that blocked the view from my porch. The box was painted to match the tree bark and positioned where I'd never notice it unless I was specifically looking for it. Professional work, expensive work, illegal work. The next morning, I called Eddie and asked him to meet me at the property. When I showed him what I'd found, his expression grew serious. "David, this is major theft. Whoever did this is pulling serious juice from your system. No wonder your voltage is fluctuating." Eddie opened the concealed junction box with tools from his truck. The interior was a maze of professional connections, switching equipment, and monitoring devices that looked like they belonged in a commercial electrical installation. "This is sophisticated stuff," Eddie said, studying the equipment. "Whoever installed this knew exactly what they were doing. See these switches? They're designed to automatically draw power when your usage is low and shut off when you're running major appliances. That's why you haven't noticed it. Until recently, the system was designed to avoid detection." "How much power are they stealing?" Eddie connected his meter to various points in the junction box. Jesus, David. They're pulling about 40% of your total capacity. During peak usage times, you're basically powering 2 properties. Can you trace where it's going? I can try. We spent the next hour following the buried cables across my property line. The trail led directly to Patricia's mansion, where it connected to an electrical subpanel that fed power to her outdoor lighting, pool equipment, and what appeared to be a large workshop or guest house behind her main building. She's been stealing your electricity to power half her property, Eddie said grimly. This setup probably saves her $300 or $400 a month in utility bills. But as I stood there, looking at Patricia's mansion, I realized that the money wasn't the point. This was about control, about making my life so difficult that I'd give up and sell to her. The electrical theft was just another weapon in her campaign to drive me away from Pine Lake. Eddie, can you disconnect this without damaging my system? Sure, but I should warn you, whoever installed this is going to know immediately when it stops working. And they're not going to be happy about it. Let them be unhappy. It's my electricity. Eddie spent another hour carefully disconnecting Patricia's illegal tap while documenting everything with photographs. When he finished, he handed me a written report detailing what he'd found. You're going to want to file a police report, he said. This is theft of services, and it's a felony given the amount of money involved. How much money? Eddie calculated quickly. Based on the equipment and the power draw, I'd estimate she's stolen about $6,000 worth of electricity over the past year. Maybe more. That afternoon, I drove to the county sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint against Patricia Whitmore for theft of services. Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos took my statement and Eddie's documentation with the thoroughness of someone who dealt with property disputes before. Mr. Peterson, this is pretty clear-cut, she said. But I should warn you that property disputes between neighbors can get messy. Are you prepared for this to escalate? Deputy, she's already escalated this. I'm just defending myself. Deputy Santos nodded. We'll investigate and file charges if the evidence supports it. But in the meantime, I'd recommend installing some security cameras around your property. People who are willing to steal electricity might be willing to do other things. I took her advice. That evening, I installed 4 wireless security cameras around my cabin, positioned to monitor the areas where Patricia's crew had been digging. The cameras were connected to my phone, so I'd receive alerts whenever they detected motion. I thought I was being paranoid. I was actually being prescient. 3 days later, at 2:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera positioned near my electrical panel. I opened the app and watched in real time as 2 figures in dark clothing approached the area where Eddie had disconnected Patricia's illegal tap. One of them was carrying what appeared to be electrical equipment. The other had a flashlight and was examining the junction box that Eddie had secured with a padlock. I called 911 immediately, then grabbed my grandfather's old baseball bat and headed outside. By the time I reached the electrical panel, the intruders were gone, but they'd left evidence of their attempt to reconnect the stolen power lines. Deputy Santos arrived 20 minutes later, followed by Eddie, who lived just 10 minutes away and had offered to respond to any nighttime emergencies involving my electrical system. They tried to bypass your disconnect, Eddie reported, after examining the junction box. But they couldn't get past the padlock, so they gave up. Did you get a good look at them on your security cameras? Deputy Santos asked. I showed her the footage on my phone. The video was clear enough to see 2 people, but their faces were obscured by hoodies and the darkness. What was clear was their familiarity with my property and the electrical system they were trying to restore. This wasn't random, Deputy Santos said. These people knew exactly what they were looking for and how to access it. The next morning, I received a phone call from Patricia. David, I understand you've been having electrical problems, she said, her voice carrying the false concern of someone offering to help with a problem they created. No electrical problems, Patricia. Just theft problems. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean the illegal tap you installed on my electrical system. The one that's been stealing my power for the past year. There was a pause. David, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. If there's an electrical connection between our properties, it must have been installed by the previous property owner. I certainly didn't authorize anything like that. Patricia, the connection was installed recently. The equipment is new, and it was specifically designed to steal power from my system. That's a very serious accusation, Patricia said, her tone shifting from false concern to barely controlled anger. I hope you have proof to support such claims. I have plenty of proof. And so do the sheriff's deputies who are investigating your theft. Another pause, longer this time. David, I think you should be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Property disputes can become very unpleasant for everyone involved. Is that a threat? It's advice from someone who understands how these situations can escalate. Patricia hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, I received a new HOA violation notice. According to the complaint, my security cameras were unsightly and inappropriate for the community aesthetic. I had 7 days to remove them or face daily fines of $100. The violation was signed by Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. That evening, as I was reviewing my options with Janet over the phone, she delivered news that made the electrical theft seem like a minor problem. David, I've been researching Patricia's background, and I found something you need to know. Whitmore Development Corporation has been quietly purchasing properties around Pine Lake for the past 3 years. Small cabins mostly. Properties belonging to elderly owners or families who couldn't afford the HOA fines. How many properties? 11 so far. All of them have been demolished and replaced with luxury homes. And all of them were purchased for significantly below market value from owners who were facing financial pressure from HOA violations. I felt the pieces clicking into place. She's systematically driving out the original property owners. That's what it looks like. And your cabin is probably the biggest prize on the lake. Prime shoreline, deep water access, and enough acreage to build something really spectacular. What can I do to stop her? Honestly, not much, as long as the HOA has legal authority over your property. But David, there's something else. I've been reviewing the original HOA incorporation documents, and I think I found a problem with Patricia's claim of authority. What kind of problem? The kind that might invalidate the entire HOA structure. But I need to do more research before I can be sure. After hanging up with Janet, I sat on my porch and looked out over the lake. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson that had looked exactly the same when my grandfather first saw this place 60 years ago. But everything else was different now. The shoreline was dominated by mansions instead of cabins. The peace was broken by the hum of swimming pool pumps and landscape lighting. And the sense of community that had once defined Pine Lake had been replaced by the cold authority of HOA bylaws and property development schemes. Patricia had stolen my electricity, but that was just the beginning. She was stealing the soul of the place my family had loved for 3 generations. The question was whether I was strong enough to stop her, or whether she'd succeed in driving me away like she had so many others. But as I watched the last light fade over the mountains, I made a decision. My grandfather had built this cabin with his own hands, and my father had maintained it for 40 years, and I'd be damned if I was going to let Patricia Whitmore take it away from me without a fight. What I didn't know was that Patricia had already decided the fight was over, and she was about to make a move that would change everything in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, My 83-year-old neighbor, Margaret Olson, who lived in the only other original cabin that Patricia hadn't managed to force off the lake. Margaret had been at Pine Lake longer than anyone, arriving in 1959 when she and her late husband bought their cabin as newlyweds. She was the unofficial historian of the community, the keeper of stories about the early days when families came to the lake to escape the world rather than transform it. I found her on her porch the morning after Patricia's phone call, feeding breadcrumbs to a family of ducks that had made their home near her dock. "Morning, Margaret," I called as I walked over from my property. "How are you holding up?" Margaret's weathered face creased into a smile. "Oh, I'm fine, David. But I heard you've been having troubles with our self-appointed queen bee. Word travels fast around here. When you've lived somewhere for 64 years, you hear everything eventually." Margaret gestured for me to sit in the chair beside her. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" I spent the next hour explaining everything: the electrical theft, the harassment through HOA violations, Patricia's systematic campaign to drive out the original property owners. Margaret listened with the patient attention of someone who'd watched many changes come to Pine Lake over the decades. "You know," she said when I finished, "Patricia reminds me of another woman who tried to take over this lake back in the 80s. Different methods, same arrogance. What happened to her?" She learned that some of us old-timers don't give up as easily as she expected. Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "David, what do you know about the original Pine Lake Community Agreement?" "I didn't know there was one." "Oh, there was. Your grandfather signed it. My husband signed it. All the original property owners signed it back in 1963. It was a simple document, just a one-page agreement about maintaining access roads and keeping the lake clean." Margaret stood up slowly and gestured for me to follow her inside. Her cabin was a time capsule of 60 years at Pine Lake, filled with photographs, fishing trophies, and the kind of comfortable furniture that gets better with age. She pulled a wooden box from a shelf above her fireplace and began sorting through papers that looked like they'd been saved since the Eisenhower administration. "Here it is," she said, pulling out a yellow document. "The original Pine Lake Community Preservation Agreement, signed on July 15, 1963. I read the document carefully. It was exactly what Margaret had described: a simple agreement between property owners to maintain the lake's natural character and provide mutual assistance with shared expenses like road maintenance. But the language was interesting. The agreement specified that Pine Lake would remain a community of modest family retreats dedicated to the preservation of natural beauty and peaceful recreation. More importantly, the agreement included a clause that prohibited any property owner from altering the essential character of the community through commercial development or the imposition of external governance structures." "Margaret, this document predates Patricia's HOA by 58 years. "It certainly does. And according to the lawyer who helped us draft it, this agreement created a legal covenant that runs with the land. Every property deed around the lake includes reference to this original agreement." I felt the first spark of hope I'd experienced in months. Does that mean Patricia's HOA might not have legal authority over the original properties? That's exactly what it might mean. Margaret smiled. "But David, there's something else you should know. That original community agreement included specific provisions about property boundaries and shared resources like water access and utility easements." She pulled out another document, a hand-drawn map of Pine Lake, showing the original property lines and shared utility corridors. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to the area around my cabin. "Your grandfather's property included utility easements that served 3 other cabins. The electrical system he installed wasn't just for his own use, it was designed to provide backup power for emergency situations." I studied the map more carefully. My grandfather's property was positioned at the center of a network of utility easements that connected most of the original cabins around the lake. Margaret, are you saying my electrical system was designed to serve other properties? In emergencies, yes. Your grandfather was an engineer, you know. He designed the system to be expandable and to provide mutual support between neighbors. But Patricia's stealing power for her regular electrical needs, not emergency backup. Oh, I know that. But David, look at where her property sits on this map. I looked. Patricia's mansion had been built on the site of the old Henderson cabin, which according to the 1963 map was connected to my grandfather's electrical system through a legitimate utility easement. Wait, I said slowly. Does this mean Patricia might actually have a legal right to connect to my electrical system? Margaret's smile grew wider. That's where it gets interesting. The original easement agreement specified that the electrical connection could only be used for modest cabin electrical needs and required the consent of the primary property owner, that's you, for any significant modifications. She pointed to a clause at the bottom of the utility easement document. See this? All electrical connections must be limited to lighting, basic appliances, and emergency equipment consistent with the cabin's role as a family retreat. Patricia's mansion uses more electricity in a month than the original cabins used in a year. So she's violated the original easement agreement? Spectacularly. But David, there's something even better. Look at this clause about utility maintenance. Margaret pointed to another section of the document. The property owner who provides utility services through easements has the right to discontinue service if connected properties violate the Community Preservation Agreement. I read the clause carefully. It was written in the formal language of 1963, but the meaning was clear. If a connected property violated the community's commitment to remaining a collection of modest family retreats, the utility provider could cut off their access. Patricia's 6,000-square-foot mansion definitely violated any reasonable definition of modest family retreat. Margaret, this is incredible. But how does this help me deal with the HOA? David, the original community agreement includes a very specific clause about governance. Let me find it. Margaret sorted through more documents until she found what she was looking for. Here, she said, Section 7, no external organization or corporate entity may impose governance, fees, or restrictions upon properties bound by this agreement without the unanimous consent of all original signatories or their legal heirs. I stared at the document. Unanimous consent? Every single property owner would have to agree. And David, there are still 4 original properties around this lake. Mine, yours, the Patterson Place, and the old Murphy cabin that's now owned by their daughter. Did any of you consent to Patricia's HOA? I certainly didn't. And I know Helen Patterson voted against it. Not sure about Murphy's daughter, but I can find out. Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out her window toward Patricia's mansion. David, I think Patricia made a very expensive mistake when she built that monstrosity. She assumed that because she bought Henderson's property, she inherited all the rights that came with it. But the utility easement agreement was specifically personal to the Henderson family. When they sold to Patricia, those easement rights should have been renegotiated. So she's been stealing my electricity without any legal right to do so? That's what it looks like to me. But David, you need to get a real lawyer to review all this. I'm just an old woman with a good memory and a box full of dusty papers. I hugged Margaret impulsively. You're a lot more than that. You might have just saved my cabin. That afternoon, I called Janet and arranged for her to meet with Margaret the next day to review all the original Pine Lake documents. If Margaret was right, Patricia's entire scheme might collapse under the weight of her own legal overreach. But first, I had to deal with the immediate problem of her escalating harassment. The next morning, I woke up to find that Patricia had made good on her threat about the security cameras. A formal HOA violation notice was taped to my front door, along with a notice that daily fines would begin immediately if the cameras weren't removed within 24 hours. Instead of removing the cameras, I installed 4 more. Then I called Deputy Santos and asked her to increase patrols around my property. If Patricia was willing to send people to attempt electrical theft in the middle of the night, there was no telling what she might try next. That evening, Janet arrived with a property law specialist named Robert Chen, who'd spent 30 years dealing with easement disputes and community governance issues. They spent 3 hours with Margaret, reviewing every document in her wooden box and taking photographs of everything. "This is remarkable," Robert said as he studied the original community agreement. "It's essentially a private covenant that predates and supersedes any HOA authority. If this document is legally valid, Patricia's entire governance structure is built on a foundation of sand." "What do we need to do to prove it?" I asked. "First, we need to verify that all the original signatories were legal property owners at the time of signing. Second, we need to confirm that the covenant language was properly recorded with the county. Third, we need to trace the legal chain of title for each property to determine whether the covenant obligations transferred to subsequent owners. How long will that take? A few weeks, if we're lucky. But David, there's something else you should know. If this covenant is valid, you have significant legal leverage against Patricia. Not just for the electrical theft, but for the entire HOA scheme." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my cabin, touching the walls my grandfather had built, looking at the family photographs that chronicled 3 generations of summers at Pine Lake. For the first time in months, I felt like victory might actually be possible. But Patricia wasn't finished with me yet. In fact, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her entire campaign against my family's legacy. A mistake that would cost her far more than the electricity she'd stolen and far more than the reputation she'd built as the Queen of Pine Lake. She was about to learn that some people will do anything to protect the things they love most. And sometimes, that desperation leads to discoveries that change everything. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came on a Saturday morning in early August, but not in the way I'd expected.